Warm welcome to this book launch today. My name is Wendy Willems. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics. And I have the pleasure to chair this event today, during which we will launch Dr. Grace Yuehan Wang's book, which will be published mid-July. And the title of the book is Dragon Innovation, Shenzhen, Lessons for the West and Global South Countries from China's Leading Innovation Cluster. So in this book, Grace tells the story of the emergence of China's technology hub, Shenzhen, and the Greater Bay Area. And she draws on extensive interviews with investors, academics, salespeople, grassroots entrepreneurs, and migrant professionals, and reflects on the lessons we can draw from this case study for the West and Global South countries. So we'll have two speakers today. Obviously, Grace will be presenting the key arguments of her book. And Grace researches science, technology, and innovation with a particular focus on Asia Pacific. Sorry. She's been a visiting fellow in our department since 2023 and recently concluded her visiting fellowship last month. She's also been a senior research fellow at the Department of Journalism at Stellenbosch University in South Africa since 2022. She earned her doctoral degree from the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, and also was the Annenberg Chair Fellow in Communication Technology and Society for 2 years. And in addition to that, she was the South Africa National Research Foundation grant holder in 2021-2022. So Grace will talk for about 40 minutes about her book, and then we'll have a 15-minute response from my colleague, Professor Bing-Chung Meng, who's a professor also in the Department of Media and Communications at the LSE. And her research interests include gender and the media, political economy of media industries, communication governance, and comparative media studies. And she's currently working on a monograph about AI industries in China, which will eventually be published by Columbia University Press. So this event will be recorded, and after Grace and Bing-Chung conclude their talks, we'll have a Q&A, and you're welcome to post your question in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. And finally, I would like to thank my colleague Luam Tesfaye for her support with this event. So if you're ready, Grace, over to you.
Thank you so very much, Wendy, for your introduction. Well, first, I want to thank my mentors and colleagues who are from the LSE and the USC Global Communications Program, since I had the privilege of interacting with world-renowned intellectuals and scholars during my doctoral study at USC because of the sister relationships of these two universities. And also many thanks to the colleagues in the department and at London School of Economics who offered their mental and intellectual support to me in the past 3 years during my visiting appointment here. So thank you. And good afternoon, everyone, and also good evening to those in Asia. It's a huge pleasure for me today to share some thoughts with you about China's innovation and its leading innovation cluster, Shenzhen, as part of my book launch today. So I'm going to share my screen here. Can you all see that? Great. So I organized my talk today around 3 aspects, as you can see. So why does Shenzhen matter? So Shenzhen matters to the audiences in the UK, not because the UK Secretary of State recently visited Shenzhen and its technology companies, right? So Shenzhen matters because it was a so-called agriculture fishing village, and then it was set as the first special economic zone in China, and then it grew into a leading global innovation cluster in the Global South. So we know there were actually many special economic zones in Africa, in Latin America, and even in some Western countries before Shenzhen's establishment as the first special economic zone in China in the 80s. But in human history, Shenzhen is the only special economic zone by far that grew into a leading global innovation cluster. So how does that happen? That really matters for policymakers and development professionals and scholars around the world. So through the lens of Shenzhen, second, I talk about some China innovation myths. So abundant academic research and the media articles try to untangle why China why China could not innovate. But a lot of the analysis and the perceptions were actually built on
Great,
old-fashioned
great.
and
Sorry to interrupt, but would you
mhm.
mind like if you click on slideshow at the top of your menu, you can start the
Oh,
slideshow, and then we can see just the screen that you're presenting on.
oh, sure.
If you go,
Is this okay now?
yeah, that's also okay. Yeah, perfect. Thank you
Oh,
so
okay,
much.
great. Thank you. Okay. Um, so yes, just a lot of academic research and the media article try to untangle why China could innovate and China could not innovate. But a lot of these perceptions and analysis were built on old-fashioned and outdated understanding of Chinese culture, its institutions, and governance models. So in this book, through the lens of Shenzhen, I try to unpuzzle some misunderstandings of China's innovation. And also, this book covers a lot of academic disciplines. But since we're having this book launch today in the Department of Media and Communications, I want to emphasize two theoretical frameworks that are very familiar to students and scholars in the field of media and communication, which are Manuel Castell's Network Society and Henry Jenkins' participatory culture. So third, uh, since we are having this book talk at LSE, and LSE is a world-leading social science university in the UK and beyond, I briefly talk about the UK innovation ecosystem. Some of the lessons were actually drawn from my collaboration with colleagues from LSE Consulting and LSE Generate in the past 3 years. So let's get started first. So why does Shenzhen matter? How does China innovate? Is China able to compete with the United States in the technological dimension? Or is Silicon Valley dying or declining? So maybe that's the reason you attend the book talk today. Well, in fact, as I wrote in the introduction chapter, when I was conducting interviews during my fieldwork in Shenzhen in 2017, my interviewees inquired about this research frequently. I told them that it is about Shenzhen's technological innovations and the comparisons with Silicon Valley in the United States. So the most common response was, well, you must know a lot about Silicon Valley and the secret recipes for making Silicon Valley a successful technology center. So people's enthusiasm and determination in making Silicon Valley in China is beyond imagination. Innovation is the driving force, is a catchphrase among people in Shenzhen. Although at that time, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, Guangzhou was ranked as #2 global innovation cluster according to the Global Innovation Index, ahead of Silicon Valley, which ranked the 5th. But most people in Shenzhen or in China at large still believe undoubtedly that China is lagging behind the United States in great deal. We need to play catch up and work diligently is a popular sentiment. So as you can see the slide here, actually in 2025, China tops the world with 24 innovation clusters, and the United States has 22 innovation clusters. And Germany ranked the third, with which only has 7 innovation clusters. But I can assure you, in 2017, when I was doing my fieldwork in Shenzhen, the Chinese people, they were not being modest. They really expressed how they really thought. But the 2018 US-China trade war was really a turning point. That the trade war marched into a technology competition between the two most powerful countries, the United States and China, over national supremacy and global power competition. So Shenzhen, as I wrote in my book, truly became a global attention center. So in fact, many Chinese netizens jokingly described the technological war between the United States and China as a war between Yuehan Strait in Nanshan District in Shenzhen City, which is Shenzhen-市南山区粤海街道, where leading Chinese technology companies such as Tencent, Huawei, DJI, Oppo, Hans Laser, BYD started their corporate ventures. So no matter how many mini Silicon Valleys nowadays in China, it is really impossible to fully understand China's technology performance and capacity without comprehending Shenzhen, the city that made it possible for technology entrepreneurs such as Huawei's Ren Zhengfei and Tencent's Pony Ma Huateng to establish private enterprises in China back in the 80s. So this book actually documents my in-person interviews with both Huawei's Ren Zhongfei and Tencent's Peng Ma Huateng. Well, actually, back at that time, the founding team of Tencent even did not know what venture capitalism was. So that is actually the beginning of Chinese entrepreneurs and and Shenzhen. So as you can see the slide here. So in 1987, the Shenzhen city government actually issued the government document to allow the establishment of private technology enterprises in Shenzhen, which is called Shenzhen Technology Enterprise Identity Card, which is the picture on the left, known as the 1987 document, which made Shenzhen the first Chinese city to allow private technology enterprises to be established in China. So that's the beginning of Shenzhen. Some people might still ask, do I still need to care about Shenzhen nowadays when Hangzhou, Chengdu, Chongqing spring up as innovation cities in China? Well, the answer is absolutely yes. I'm saying that not because I wrote a book on Shenzhen. So for people who want to keep themselves updated about China, should pay close attention to Shenzhen because it still continues to play an institutional pioneering role in China. For instance, China's private sector promotion law, the first fundamental law dedicated to promoting the private economy in China, was actually passed on April 30th, 2025. But 2 years before that, in early 2023, the Shenzhen local government actually introduced several measures to promote the expansion and improvement of its local private economy. So Shenzhen's pilot policy measures actually set a foundation for China's private economy promotion law. Particularly, those Shenzhen measures encourage domestic private enterprises to participate in national science and innovation projects, to take the lead in establishing industries that match with the international standards and trends. So therefore, as China's first special economic zone, Shenzhen still continues a very critical role in China's institutional experiments, innovation, and economic reforms. Also, from the perspective of academic contributions, so Shenzhen innovation experience, as I documented in my book in the research of almost the past 10 years, shows that the long-term celebrated Silicon Valley model is not the only innovation prototype available. Imitating Silicon Valley or any Western technology experiences may not work for countries in the global south, where poverty alleviation is still unresolved. Also, Shenzhen's success also challenges the widely known China innovation success, which credits everything to the Chinese state and the state-led approach. So cultures, entrepreneur cultures, institutions, for instance, family as a very unique type of social group and social institution, they all contribute to Shenzhen's development and innovation success. So far, I hope you come to the right place today. And talk about Shenzhen, right? So China's innovation becomes very outstanding in recent years, not just because of the US-China technology competition and trade war. So in recent years, with regard to global R&D companies, VC deals, publication in quantity and quality, actually China leads the world. Especially in areas such as R&D expenditures, China is now the number one, overshadow a lot of high-income economies. But in order to understand China, how has China made it? Through the lens of Shenzhen, it is very critical to unpuzzle or even get rid of some misunderstandings of a China innovation. So the first I want to talk about is the myth is a culture. So the conventional and stereotypical understanding of Chinese culture is that it is a government-dominated top-down system that lacks risk-taking spirit and entrepreneurialism and creativity. But my book, Chapter 4, City Culture, Experimental and Entrepreneur DNA, actually stems from my personal stories when I first heard of the word 下海, which refers to people's departure from a government-protected system and jobs and went wealth creation business opportunities on their own. So Shenzhen, as a typical migrant city in China, imitates Silicon Valley's entrepreneur culture. As we know, Silicon Valley attracts immigrant entrepreneurs all over the world. But most importantly, it is the Shenzhen dream a term I coined in chapter 4 that really ignites the hope for people's possibility and prosperity when the open-end reform was first established in China. Because we know no matter if people are migrants in the Shenzhen case or if people are immigrants in the Silicon Valley case, no one aims for failure when they leave their families, relatives, established networks. So Shenzhen culture really encourages risk-taking, open-mindedness, and entrepreneurialism. This actually poses a question for policymakers and development professionals all over the world. So what comes first? A special innovative soil that nurtures experiments and innovation, or a group of people who long for adventures to cultivate a unique fertile ground. So the second misunderstanding of Chinese innovation culture is actually closely related to Shenzhen's manufacturing and maker culture. In my book, Chapter 7, Shenzhen Grassroots Participatory Innovation, Let the People Make, the examination of makers and Shenzhen manufacturing networks reveal a bottom-to-top innovation culture, which differs from Silicon Valley's elite culture. But before we understand Shenzhen's grassroots participatory innovation culture, let's look at the slide and see what this participatory culture means. So I borrowed media scholar Helen Jenkins' famous work, Participatory Culture, which might be very familiar to a lot of students and scholars in the media and communication department. So a participatory culture is a culture with relatively low barriers to artistic expressions and civic engagement. Strong support for creating and sharing one's creations, and some type of informal mentorship whereby what is known by the most experienced is passed along to novices. So a participatory culture is also one in which members believe their contributions matter and feel some degree of social connection with one another. At least they care what other people think about what they have created. So a very, very apparent example of this kind of participatory culture is actually rooted in Huaqiangbei, the largest electronics market in Asia and also in China. So as you can see, as documented, so people at Huaqiangbei all know each other. One person will do one portion of the work and they will give the other portion of the work to other friend to do so they can finish the work very quickly. This is how Huaqiangbei works. Some people can design, other people can manufacture, and other people can sell. So everyone is working together. That is why it only takes 1 or 2 months for a product to be ready for the market. So participants in Huaqiangbei electronics manufacturing, for instance, factory workers, migrant laborers, designers, and entrepreneurs, entered the ecosystem with relatively low engineering, design, and business barriers. So they show each other the support in the manufacturing supply chain and collectively make commercial profits. So Shenzhen grassroots participatory innovation clearly indicates the role of local culture, informal networks, and the different types of institutions' role in Shenzhen's innovation success. So the two kinds of culture, as I discussed in my book and here, refuse the fundamental misunderstanding of China's innovation success, which credits everything to the Chinese state and state planning. Because I think people should acknowledge that no matter how an economic plan or an innovation policy is articulated and designed, if its people are risk averse and close-minded, how can Shenzhen form its experimental and entrepreneurial culture? But does the state play a role? Of course, yes. So the second myth I'm going to talk about is about the role of the state. So studies of Western technology centers and innovation often downplay the role of the state in building and developing innovation clusters. But to fully understand Shenzhen's economic miracle and its innovation path, no one can deny the role of the state, like 集中力量办大事, which means the utilization of concentrated power and resources to focus on what matters the most. But the state involvement and support are not really unique to China. The government funding and support in technology innovation even happened in the United States, for example, in the 1980s. When the US semiconductor industry competed against the Japanese, semiconductor manufacturing technology as a consortium actually was formed and started. in 1987, initial funding came from the US government to actually aid private research in semiconductor industry in the United States. So some scholars, even including some US ones, actually highlighted the role of appropriate government policies as one of the critical national innovation system elements. So appropriate policies may include research and development support to enterprises or policies associated with foreign trade and investment. So besides central government support or federal government support in different national contexts, the success of Silicon Valley, which long been viewed as not planned and not anticipated, actually really downplayed the role of state. But in fact, California state government actually invested in infrastructure and tried to develop public services, for instance, such as transportation, housing, healthcare, and higher education. As we know, the UC system is really an exemplar of the California state higher education, right? But what I emphasize in my book is actually the role of the local governance, which is the third myth I'm going to talk about. Because many people rush to examine China's innovation ecosystem and conclude that China has the centralized model, which gives China very competitive strategic advantages. But my book reviews that despite China's centralized political system, Shenzhen's economic and technology success really demonstrate the significant role of adventurous, risk-taking, and entrepreneurial local government officials have played. So in my book, I borrow the term bureaucratic entrepreneurs to describe this type of special local government officials. So I want to share a little bit story about the term bureaucratic entrepreneurs. So I borrowed this term from the book, Making State Capitalism, The Taiwan Connection, a book written by Taiwanese scholar who is a professor at UC Berkeley, Xing Youtian. So she used the term to describe Guangdong local government officials when she conducted her research in the early 80s to 90s. So when I was writing my book, I was thinking whether I should use entrepreneur bureaucrats in my book, since I'm writing about local government officials, right? But I ended up borrowing her term, bureaucratic entrepreneurs, because when we go back to the historical context of special economic zone, we know the so-called China's economic master Deng Xiaoping said, "Oh, the central government doesn't have any money, but we can give you some special policy. You guys go kill a bloody road." I'm sure a lot of Chinese are very familiar with the term 下出一条血路. So I thought that that's actually very similar to how entrepreneurs get started, right? So when they get started with their ventures, they don't really have any funding or any money. So that's why I used this term bureaucratic entrepreneurs to describe the Shenzhen local government officials. So in my book, chapter 5, Local Governance, Bureaucratic Entrepreneurs, reviews the entrepreneur roles local politicians played in attracting investment, building Shenzhen-based trade and technology platforms, as well as designing and implementing local industries by connecting Shenzhen's geographical and strategic advantages with the international market. So there are many examples documented in my book describing how Shenzhen local government officials implement the spirit, enterprise as the main body, and the government as the back and support. So as you can see the slide, so bureaucratic entrepreneurs, they pioneer institutional experiments and innovation. They act as platform officials. And, a lot of Shenzhen government officials, they don't really intervene local business a lot, as a lot of people think of Chinese, Chinese local government officials. And the Shenzhen government is really very efficient. A lot of transnational entrepreneurs and investors speak highly of government efficiency in Shenzhen. And also the government officials in Shenzhen, they pursue lifelong learning. As I documented in my book, chapter 11, I documented how I interacted with a lot of Shenzhen government officials when I was a doctoral student in the US, because I acted as an interpreter for a lot of them. So when they came to executive trainings in the US. So as we know, Shenzhen local government officials really serves as the backend support for local business. That actually leads to the fourth myth I'm going to talk about, which is the R&D investment. So the book reveals that innovation success in China is actually not one recipe for all. So firm level R&D investment is one of the key contributors that enables Shenzhen to leapfrog from a fishing village to have become the headquarters of leading Chinese technology companies. So findings in this book refute the popular belief that China's innovation ecosystem rely heavily on government funding. In fact, China's innovation cities, for instance, the famous ones centered around Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen, really demonstrate distinctive regional innovation characteristics in China, especially in terms of R&D expenses. As you can see the slide here, this is Beijing government R&D and corporate R&D from 2016 to 2020. You can see Beijing government R&D actually maintained a higher level than corporate R&D from this period. But in Shenzhen, from the same period, from 2016 to 2020, the cooperative R&D expenditures led tremendously than government R&D expenditures. So that's a key characteristics of the Shenzhen innovation ecosystem. So innovative firms and their establishment and their investment in R&D really shed light on the understanding of fostering innovation clusters in both developing countries and developed countries. Because the Shenzhen innovation success shows that there are multiple forms of innovation carriers, and enterprise is a key carrier of all the innovation platforms. But we know, applied research and commercialization driven by profits is usually a top priority for a lot of corporations, right? But the book reveals that companies such as Huawei and BGI, which is called Huadajiyin in Chinese, a very famous biotech company, they invest heavily in basic scientific research and discovery, either through their own labs or through university to industry collaborations. Well, actually, BGI Huadajiyin created a very famous international academic journal that has a partner relationship with Oxford University Press. So those examples actually show there are a lot of enterprises actually invest in basic scientific research and discoveries. So with that said, I'm going to move to the fifth misunderstanding about building innovation clusters. So this book definitely challenges traditional understandings of the role of universities in innovation clusters because Shenzhen didn't and even doesn't have any prestigious research universities. But scholarly studies on the role of universities and technology innovations vary due to their analytical context differences. So the analysis of a Shenzhen innovation cluster is very significant because, like I said earlier, there was no widely known research universities in Shenzhen. In my book, Chapter 8, Shenzhen R&D Ecosystem, and Chapter 9, Human Capital and National Competitiveness, examined well-developed vocational education systems and virtual universities since the early 90s to make up for the absence of top-ranked physical universities in Shenzhen. And also from a network perspective, the book displays how Shenzhen has established and expanded its domestic and global knowledge and research networks. So I think for countries in the global south, they don't really have to wait for the establishment of prestigious research universities for local innovation to blossom. It's like you don't have to be young to be innovative, but you can be young and innovative if you get connected with the right established nodes. So for countries, for instance, in Africa, in Latin America, and in Southeast Asia, they can definitely get connected with top-ranked universities in UK, in China, in the United States to build their innovation clusters. So far, I talked about some misunderstandings of a Chinese innovation, but Shenzhen or Chinese innovation is far from perfect. And some of the issues actually have not been discussed much about in China and on the world stage, as social and cultural evolutions and struggles are often neglected in economy and technology conversations. But in my book, chapter 6, The Entrepreneur Ecosystem in Shenzhen, the comparison between startup incubators and accelerators in Shenzhen and Silicon Valley indicates the lack of a supportive mentorship to budding Chinese entrepreneurs from an ecosystem perspective. So I interviewed a lot of people who run startup incubators, accelerators, and also interviewed a lot of young entrepreneurs. And some of them expressed that there's a lack of mentorship. But so the lack of a mentorship in Shenzhen really depicts very serious Chinese innovation drawback, which really requires societal efforts in the long run. Social participation shall be rewarded in the entrepreneurship journey, right? But actually, this kind of drawback is actually not acknowledged by the government. So fostering and encouraging a supportive social culture is consistent actually with suggestions put forward formulating China's 15th five-year plan for national economic and social development that is issued October 23rd, 2025. So in the official Chinese document, it states that China needs to foster an open and competitive innovation ecosystem with global competitiveness. So it is necessary to support innovation and entrepreneurship among young scientific and technology talents. So as we can tell, right, the government actually acknowledges the drawbacks of the Chinese innovation from an ecosystem perspective. So I think it is very important that the society, right, the Chinese society also links with the international society to foster an open innovation ecosystem in China. So this is a table of contents of my book. As you can see, this book contains 11 chapters. I hope so far the book interests you and you would like to recommend to your libraries, to your friends, and you would like to pick it up and read. And like I said, since we're having this book talk at LSE, I want to briefly talk about the UK innovation system. So in recent years, in order to rebuild the UK economy, especially to build an innovation-led UK economy, the UK government, for instance, the Department of Science, Technology and Innovation, actually put forward a lot of government strategies and approaches to rebuild regional innovation clusters in the UK. As you can see, this is just some screenshot from the Department of Science, Technology and Innovation of the UK government. So the UK government tries to increase private investment in innovation clusters. They try to ensure those clusters can communicate their investable opportunities to the investors, right? I don't know whether that's the reason the UK Secretary of State visited Shenzhen, right? And they also want to ensure people across the UK can benefit from the innovation-led economy. So from my past work in the UK through my collaborations with a lot of colleagues from LSE, I think it is very certain that the UK does have fantastic university resources. But from my perspective, also as I argued in my book, it's entrepreneur university, it's not a university that plays a key role in fostering local innovation clusters. I don't know how many time is left.
You have another 5 minutes
So,
if you like.
okay, we only have 5 minutes. So I think probably I will just wrap up here, but it leaves a lot of space for discussions. And like I argued in the UK case, right? It's like UK has tremendous university resources, but it's the entrepreneur universities, not the universities. And it is the entrepreneur scientists, not just the researchers and scientists that play a critical role in building regional and national innovation clusters. So thank you very much. And I think I will just hand over to my respondent, Professor Meng. Thank you.
Shall I jump right in, Wendy?
Yes, feel free to. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for a wonderful talk, Grace, and many congratulations on the
Thank
book.
you.
Um, I find this totally fascinating because so much of what you said really resonates with my own fieldwork experience in preparation for my current book. There are many things I wanted to say, but I will try to be concise. I think what I'm going to do in the next 10, 12 minutes or so is just to tease out some of the key points that I see particularly resonating with my own research and also my thinking on this issue, and then maybe ask a few related questions after I reflected on how I find, the synergy between our research. And I'm gonna organize these thoughts probably in a bit of a reverse order in which that you talk through them. What I particularly appreciate about how you frame the book is that you try to offer some kind of critique and counter argument. You started by saying, there are all these myths about innovation in China. And I really share that. And I think that's probably also a common sentiment shared by a lot of us working on China right now, given all this hype, given how frequently China appear in news reports and also in academic discussion. Often, when we embark on a new project, it's out of discontent of what's being said and out of this urge to offer a different narrative. I think the first thing I want to pick up is the role of the state, and I think you really emphasize that, and I think it's also important to emphasize not just the role of the central state, but also the role of the local state, and to recognize also, I think sometimes the agenda of the central state and the agenda of the local state can also have, discrepancy or inconsistency. They don't always want the same thing because often for local government officials, they want their deliverables, they want their KPIs, and they are thinking about their political career. And also because of how, the whole political and cadre system works in China, it's very rare that any government official, provincial, municipal level would stay in one place for an extended period of time. So what the local official often want to do is to have something that they can put under their name during the 5-year tenure when they are at a place, which means that some of these can be rather short term and also counter the overall agenda of the central state. So I think that when we try to understand the ecology of technological innovation in China, the role of the state really cannot be overstated. Um, and I think it's also interesting if you think about, you mentioned the US-China tech race, and I think to a large extent, the reason why the US now feels so threatened about technological advancement and innovation coming out of China is not just because in the sort of just at the technological level that they feel like they're being taken over. I think probably what's more important is they suddenly are having doubt about the whole political economy, the whole system that they have taken so much pride in, that they think that the quote unquote free market would encourage flourishment of technological innovation. But now when they look at China, they look at a country with a whole set of very rigorous industrial policy, and also state subsidy and also state, what we call national guidance fund to be channeled to strategic priorities. I think, for example, at the moment, so much funding from the state is being poured into semiconductor chips. So I think that there's the role of the state, and also it's important when we look at within the China, both the kind of friction between the central and the local state, and also horizontally within China, that is the variation of regional state roles or the regional priority of different provincial states. And that's something I'm also trying to do in my book, and that's why I picked two different empirical sites. One is more in the inland and has a different kind of innovation culture. So that's the first thing. And I think relatedly, the question I want to ask is that at the beginning, when you mentioned your theoretical framework, you made reference to Castell, you made reference to Jenkins, and both happen to be, USC scholars. And I want to sort of push you out of the USC zone a bit, and ask, when you were writing this, when you are trying to reconceptualize the role of the state, what are some of the theoretical literature that you find useful in conceptualizing the role of the Chinese state? So that's the first thing. Secondly, I like what you said about bureaucratic entrepreneurs. Although I initially, when you first mentioned the term, I thought the term was referring to entrepreneurs, but actually you are talking about government officials. You're talking about bureaucrats. And then I thought, my experience talking to entrepreneurs in China, both in Shenzhen and in Guizhou, is also there's another side to this. And I believe it's a symbiotic aspect. That is, I find Chinese entrepreneurs are particularly well-versed in government policy, in the strategic priority of the state. They are also very good, I think, in the current moment. They are also very shrewd in sometimes mobilizing discourse about US-China competition, about technological race and the geopolitics to demand resource or favorable policy from the government. So I think there are two sides to this, right? That you have the government officials who sometimes even act as venture capitalists. In the case, for example, in my hometown, Hefei has become famous for this. A lot of people say the municipal government of Hefei sometimes act as venture capitalists. But then on the other hand, I think you also have entrepreneurs. I think these are very different from the kind you see in the Silicon Valley. I mean, in the Silicon Valley, of course, there has also been a shift. I wouldn't say that, Elon Musk is certainly someone who can only be where he is now because he's so good at leveraging and building relationship with the state. So it's not really the kind of libertarian culture that they themselves want to depict. But I think at least the discourse of the Silicon Valley, the narrative that Silicon Valley want to put forward is that they want to keep the state at arm's length, that they want to be left alone, and they want to have their autonomy. But I think in the Chinese context, exactly also because of the first point I was mentioning, because of the central role of the state at different levels, I think Chinese entrepreneurs are also very good at reading policy shift and at reading the priority of the government, and also mobilizing strategically whatever either discursive or actual material resource to their advantage. So that's the second thing. And thirdly, I think it's probably also worth relatedly, related to my second point about Chinese entrepreneurs, I wonder, you mentioned that there's this innovative spirit in Shenzhen. So I wonder what's your explanation about the origin or the genealogy of this innovative spirit? Because, how did Shenzhen got from a small fishing village to where it is now? Where does this innovative spirit come from? And then thirdly, we come to the very core concept in the title of your book, which is innovation. I think when we look at the trajectory of technological innovation in China, it also offers useful lesson for us to unpack the very notion of innovation. That is, what do we mean when we say innovation? Why is it that people felt, or people outside China felt, that they were caught by surprise when there are all these, new innovations coming from China? Why is it that even though by the time, at the beginning of 2025, when DeepSeek released its model, one could say that by that time, the world already knew that China could innovate, but still, right, there was that huge surprise that, oh, DeepSeek came up with this new large language model. Probably, I think there's some unpacking about the very notion of innovation that's worth doing. That is, to what extent, and I think, Lily Irani's book, Chasing Innovation, is an excellent reference about that. That is, to what extent our perception and understanding of innovation has been shaped by Silicon Valley, by what the Americans would recognize as innovation. And I think Huaqiangbei, of course, is the best case to illustrate that. If you go there, just wandering through the stores, and there is so much innovation, yet a large proportion of that were not really visible or recognized outside China, or at least I think in the global north. So related to that, I want to ask what are your interlocutors' understanding of innovation? Because one thing I heard, which struck me, and I heard that more than once from different tech investors and entrepreneurs themselves, is that still to this day, some of them would say, oh, Silicon Valley is very good at moving from 0 to 1. And China is very good at moving from 1 to 100, meaning that still Silicon Valley came up with something brand new, original, and China is very good at scaling up and also putting that on, to commercialized application. So I wonder, is that also something that you hear, that to what extent? And I think you mentioned maybe you started the fieldwork in 2017, which was also a different period of time. So some of your recent observation, do Chinese tech entrepreneurs still use Silicon Valley as a golden standard? Do they still think that they are trying to catch up with the Silicon Valley? Yeah, so I think those are the three main things. And then lastly, I just want to say that regarding the ecosystem of innovation, I think you made a very good point that in a way, the fact that Shenzhen didn't start with having any major research universities didn't seem to sort of put major constraint on the kind of innovation coming out of that city. Although I think what's interesting was that I remember that was the first time I went as part of the field trip for this. It was back in 2018, maybe. That was when a few universities in Hong Kong are all trying to set up their Shenzhen campus. I think it started with City University, with Chinese University of Hong Kong, and now you have Hong Kong University of Science Technology. And one of the colleagues at the Southern University of Science and Technology, Nanfang Keda, was telling me all this, and he just said, "Look, the look at the GDP of Shenzhen and look at the where Hong Kong is now. It's not surprising that all these Hong Kong universities now want to set up their Shenzhen campus. So in a way, even though Shenzhen didn't start with this, but I think because of the technological innovation, because of the prosperity that the city has been going through, now they are in a very good position to attract, and they do want to. And I think they also realize that in order to make the whole ecosystem of tech innovation sustainable, they still need good research universities. And they are, I think, the city government is putting in a lot of investment attracting these major research universities to open their Shenzhen campus. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much to both Grace and Bing Chung for really fascinating presentations. I learned a lot from these. And again, a reminder that Grace's book will be out next month, mid-July, and my colleague Luam has posted a link to the book in the chat, so do check it out. And also a reminder for anyone who would like to ask a question to submit your question in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. But before I take some questions for the audience, I just would like to give Grace a chance to respond to the 3 questions that Bing Chung raised.
Thank you so very much, Wendy, for organizing this book talk, and thanks for Bing Chun's response and comments and questions. I'm glad we resonate both as China scholars and also, for observers of a lot of innovation happening in China. So first, I want to talk about the Chinese state, right? So even though my former doctoral advisor is Manuel Castells, but my work actually was heavily influenced by his regional economic planning position at UC Berkeley, because we know Manuel Castells was a professor at UC Berkeley regional economic planning for over 20 years. So my work is really heavily influenced by scholars in School of Public Policy and regional economic planning and economic development. But in terms of the Chinese state, actually in Manuel Castells' famous work, he wrote about the role of developmental state. So I think both the Shenzhen local government and also Chinese government can be considered as developmental state. So in my book, as you can see from the table of contents, right? So I actually traces back to the historical domestic and international context of establishing special economic zones in China. But because of the time limit of the presentation today, I didn't really talk about that. So before Deng Xiaoping, wanted to set up the special economic zone with, a lot of advice from the Central Committee. He visited Singapore. He talked with Lee Kuan Yew, right, the founding father of Singapore, and the kind of developmental state Singapore represents really appealed to Deng Xiaoping, right? So when we understand Shenzhen as a special economic zone, I think it is a little bit like a parallel to understand Singapore as a developmental state. So that's the question of the state. And I think in terms of the entrepreneurs, understanding and analysis of government policies, I really think Professor Meng really made a strong case here, because I can tell you an example. When I was doing my field work last year in Longgang district, so Longgang is a kind of a rising district in Shenzhen, trying to develop artificial intelligence, right? So one of the artificial education-focused artificial intelligence startup, they actually relocated their company from Qianhai to Longgang, because they wanted to focus their artificial intelligence startup in the education directory. And they know Longgang district is trying to develop in that trajectory. So I think that really tells, how the Shenzhen entrepreneurs and also maybe, Chinese entrepreneurs, they really pay close attention to, both local and the government industry policies and planning, right? So that is the second question, right? And the third question, I think that is regarding the discourse of innovation. That is actually written in my book. When I was doing my work in 2018, I interviewed some entrepreneurs from Europe. And I actually documented in my book. There's no political, ideological, preferences, but those European entrepreneurs who actually worked in Shenzhen at that time shared with me that they prefer to stay and develop their hardware startups in Shenzhen and then going to Silicon Valley. And the one entrepreneur even told me that Silicon Valley is bullshit. I'm sure, he didn't exaggerate, because if you want to create a hardware startup, you wanna be in the supply chain ecosystem, right? You want your assemblies, you want your products to be delivered within hours, right? Not within days or within months during COVID. So I think that is, the innovation discourse, I think is really shifting. The discourse is shifting not because US-China competition or trade war. I think a lot of international investors or entrepreneurs who really focus themselves on building, startups, they recognize this kind of shifting of the innovation discourse. And also, I think one question I made a note, I think it returned in terms of the university, right? That actually I did a lot of critical analysis in my book. When I think Shenzhen is still a special economic zone, so it can do a lot of pioneering institutions in economic reforms. But in terms of educational reforms, I think Shenzhen local government is limited. So, for instance, the Southern Science and Technology University, which is Nanfang Keji Daxue, right? So, Nanfang Keji Daxue was actually was called to be established in early 2012. But the establishment of that university went into a lot of struggles because the Shenzhen local government and the Guangdong provincial government did not have enough autonomy to reform educations in China. So I think I want to just bring that up. And also to re-emphasize Shenzhen is a special economic zone. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Grace, for your response. So we'll now move on to the Q&A. So we have two questions already, and I'll just read these out. So first question is from Chanao Ye, who is a fellow in our department. So he says, I have a general question about innovation. As you talked about the grassroots participatory culture, especially Hua, Qiang, Bei, and the role of local governments, I'm wondering, do you see any inconsistency or even tensions between the innovation pursued, I think, by different stakeholders? So for example, the central state, local government officials, and those who do their business in Hua, Qiang, Bei.
Okay.
You're welcome to respond to this question
Okay.
first.
Yeah, very sure. Thank you so very much. This is actually a very important question. Like I said, because of a time limitation, I could not go through how, some grassroots entrepreneurs and the makers in Huaqiangbei actually upgrade their, maker innovation to some cutting edge, innovations that was born from Huaqiangbei. Actually, that is documented in my book. So actually, at the very beginning, Huaqiangbei was kind of chaotic, right? Even though there are a lot of makers, a lot of innovations going on, but there was a lack of a regulation. Seriously, there was a lack of a regulation. But the lack of a regulation also spurred this kind of innovation, right? So that is actually a symbiotic relationship. But in 2011, the central state government in China issued the call for indigenous innovation in China. So I think that can be considered as the beginning of China's, self-dependent indigenous innovation from the central government level. So at that time, a lot of, companies, for instance, 3D, 3Nod. So some people probably heard of that company. 3Nod is actually quite a successful startup in Shenzhen now, focused on robotics and artificial intelligence. They were a maker innovation, a grassroots entrepreneur startup, and then grew from Huaqiangbei because when the Chinese central government called for the upgrading of innovation, they upgraded themselves, and grow into a so-called, robotics startup now. So I do think that question kind of asked what I documented the trajectory in my book.
Great, thank you. And then there's a question from Professor Emeritus Robin Mansell, who you know and was previously or still based in our department. So thanks for the presentation. Please comment on whether the pattern of corporate investment in Shenzhen is an exception or it happens in other places. If it's an exception, how does that fit with the slide showing very large government public investment, and what prevents it from spreading?
So thank you so very much for that question. I think that is a very unique case in Shenzhen. So the Shenzhen, the innovative firms really invest a lot in their corporate R&D expenditures. As in my book, I actually did a comparison between Huawei and Cisco, the two, world-renowned telecommunications companies. So in 10 years range, Huawei's, corporate R&D expending has been increasing tremendously, but Cisco actually maintains pretty much the same level in 10 years. Even though one is in RMB and one is in US currency, right? But, the effort you made into the R&D expenditures, I use that as an example. But in order to answer that question, I want to give you an example that is actually documented in my book, Chapter 5, Local Governance, Bureaucratic Entrepreneurs. So I use Nanshan District government officials as an example. So Nanshan District, so they actually issued a kind of document called Technology Rating White Paper. So Nanshan District government does not invest in startups in that district directly, but they issue that kind of rating as a reference for local banks. So the local banks can refer to the government white paper to decide if the local banks want to loan money to the startups within that district or not. So that is a very, I think that is a very unique, collaboration between the district government with the local startups, right? So I think that's why you see that is a cooperative R&D expanding, not government R&D expanding, but actually government played a role in that. Yeah. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. And just a reminder, feel free to post any questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. I maybe might ask you two questions. First of all, my expertise, as you know, is mostly on Africa and particularly on Southern Africa. And your presentation, particularly on the grassroots innovation model, also reminded me of the early beginnings of Nollywood cinema in Nigeria, which also largely was kind of a grassroots initiative. And later, like we see more kind of state support, state grants, and kind of more kind of engagement of the state with this kind of cinema. And I wonder if you had any thoughts on that, parallel perhaps. And then my second question is more on kind of the politics of knowledge production, which is also an area that I'm interested in. And I was really interested in how you framed your book through these kind of dispelling these 5 myths, right? And I assume also your book primarily maybe targets audiences outside China. And it reminds me also, as scholars of media and technology in the global South, that's often what we are grappling with in our work. And sometimes our institutions require us to publish with global North scholars, and we kind of become translators of this experience, right? Almost like foreign correspondents, trying to make this material understandable to kind of audiences who are based elsewhere. So I wanted to ask you, what your book would look like if it would primarily present your material to Chinese readership. Would it be different? What would your key argument be in relation to kind of Chinese readers who might be more familiar, with the material, and to which you might not have to dispel these myths that you're mentioning in your book? So So I was just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, thank you, Wendy. I will just go with your second question, and I think that is closely related to a Chinese language version of this book, right? Yes, I think you asked a very good question. I think, well, first, I think a lot of Chinese are, uh, are confused about some innovation, China's innovation as well, right? A lot of Chinese, they think everything is about the state, but like I said, right, it's not everything about the state. And there are also strong regional innovation characteristics. And also, for instance, in terms of the origin of Shenzhen, a lot of Chinese think at the very beginning, people who went to Shenzhen, they just want to make money. But actually, as I documented in my book, some early local government officials in Shenzhen, they actually created their high prestigious local government official jobs in other provinces and cities in China. And they moved to Shenzhen. I have one example in my book who is a high level government, who was actually a high level government official in Hunan province. But he went to Shenzhen as a Hunan government official and he fell in love with the city. He told me he never saw a city that is so clean with wide streets. That's his exact words. So he went back home and he told his wife that he wanted to move to Shenzhen. And all his family opposed to this idea except for his wife, because his wife could speak Cantonese. His wife is from Guangxi province. So his wife supported him and moved to Shenzhen with him. But he quit his job as a high-level government official in Hunan province and worked as a secretary to the Shenzhen mayor at that time. So when I interviewed him, he was already a high-level government official in Shenzhen. But when he talked about his story, I still felt that enthusiasm. So that's actually, I think that's a misconception even among a lot of Chinese. Not only early migrants who went to Shenzhen who want to make money. So people were really driven that kind of newness, right? That prosperity and the possibility for different kind of professions, right? So that is the first question. The second question, I think your first question is about Nollywood. Yeah, I think my research and my job in South Africa actually improved my understanding about my work's contribution to the global south. In order to answer your question, I think institutional capacity really matters a lot in enhancing innovation and entrepreneurship in not only South Africa but also other countries in the global south. I can share one story with you that happened between myself and my interviewees in South Africa. So that person told me back in 2009, some professors and students at one university created some type of electronic vehicle. That was very early on, back in 2009. And they told this idea to local government officials in South Africa. But at that time, the local government officials in South Africa did not really recognize the importance of electronic vehicles or new energy, right? So I didn't write that in my book, but I think that this really highlights the role of institutional capacity and the importance of educated and continue to educate local government officials at different levels, right? Yeah.
Great, thank you. I'm wondering if Bing Chung, would you like to respond at all to some of these questions or to Grace's answers?
Yeah, maybe just to build on what Grace already said in answering your first question. I do agree. I think, the institutional capacity is the key here, and of course also state capacity. I think also, especially what I observed in the province of Guizhou, which is traditionally, a poorly developed areas sort of tend to rank at the bottom of the GDP across all the 31 Chinese provinces. If I look at what the provincial government and also municipal government of the capital of the province, Guiyang, have been trying to do and think about then the trajectory of Nollywood. I think there is also maybe this is something unique and also as part of the legacy of the socialist China, that is the mandate of the government, the mandate of the state, that there is still, I think, this very strong mandate of delivering livelihood growth, prosperity to the population. I think related to what Grace was saying earlier about the role of the developmentalist state. So to a large extent, this current sort of policy orientation toward encouraging building, for example, in Guizhou, building data centers and building also digital infrastructure is very closely linked with the mandate of delivering growth, employment, and prosperity. I think maybe that's something also we need to understand from a historical perspective, that is the role of the state. And I've also been wondering whether that also play that kind of relationship, whether that also play a role in shaping Chinese people's perception about new technology as well. That is, of course, in previously when I was presenting at a different at the U.S. China seminar series organized by the RR department at LSE. I was asked by this American, I think maybe he's a career diplomat. So he was asking whether Chinese people also, given the kind of very critical view and also often the dystopian narrative about what technology could bring or what digital technology could bring, sort of this doomsday and all that. And he was asking whether there's an equivalent, a Chinese equivalent of that, which got me thinking that my impression that overall in general, I'm not saying that there is no critical voice, that there's, now with AI, of course, there is critical voice. But I think in general, the sort of the average people's perception about technology is a rather receptive one, because they think of technology as something that could potentially improve their life. And I think it has to do with their implicit understanding about the role of the state or what the state would do. That for them, even when private sector could impinge on privacy and all that, they have, I think there is this implicit trust that the state would intervene if things got really bad. And because the state has this mandate of delivering sort of good life for everyone. So I think there is this, and I think maybe also that is something that's probably difficult to understand if you only observe outside China, that you think that, oh, why are they so? For example, I think, before SpaceX, Elon Musk, had this fantasy of having an equivalent of WeChat, developing the equivalent of WeChat, which became sort of the everyday infrastructure of everyday life, digital infrastructure of everyday life. But that would never happen, even if the technology is there, because people won't embrace it as Chinese people do. People outside, in many countries, I think especially in European countries, people would never embrace it like that because they think that this is something potentially threatening, potentially dangerous. So I've been thinking about to what extent a different kind of relationship between the populace and the state also shape the general perception about technology, or even change to that for that matter.
Thank you,
I just
Bing-Chun. Yeah, I
want
think
to
that
add briefly to what, yes, Professor Meng just said. I do think Chinese people in general are more acceptive to technology adoptions and the new technologies. Because I did a paper a long time ago during my doctorate study about WeChat Pay. So at that time, Apple was also trying to introduce Apple Pay in the US, but the resistance from the American people to use Apple Pay was really, really very high, right? So, a lot of American people are so reliant on the credit card, so they didn't want to switch to use Apple Pay. So I just want to, add on that. I think there's a technology acceptance in the differences. Yeah.
Thank you both. I think, yeah, those are very important points. And also in the kind of in relation to the South African context, yeah, I think it's important to see technology in relation to other forms of investment. How are digital platforms received in relation to mining companies, for example? It's not very different. There was always a lack of regulation of other types of investment as well. And in that sense, it's nothing new. And also, yeah, I can sort of identify with the hopes that technology or that people invest into technology. I think that's also something that I have seen in my work on Zambia, as well as South Africa, where in South Africa AI is often seen as a way of closing the kind of inequalities that apartheid produced, which is kind of ironic given the central role of technology in producing kind of apartheid as well, producing the kind of exploitation of black workers and so on. So yeah, I think there's lots more a lot more scope perhaps for comparative studies on this in the context of the global South. Just want to ask if there are any final questions from anyone in the audience. Feel free to post a question. If not, I think we can close our session here, and really want to thank both Grace and Bing Chung for their wonderful presentations, and to the audience for your questions and your attendance of this event. So this event will be posted on our YouTube channel in due course. And again, congratulations to Grace on your book, which will be out in about 3 weeks officially. So do check out the website. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Wendy.
Bing-Chun.
And congratulations, Grace. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.